Sometimes, as world builders, what we need is a summary of an era, a feeling for what would fit the timeline that we are trying to build in. That's what I'm covering in my series, An Era Defined. Today, we'll be diving into a world of declining priest kings, blossoming philosophies, and of course, some of the juicy societal changes that come with that. Welcome to Just-in-Time World's Eras Defined, the new world of philosophy, with your host, Marie Mullaney. Just a short PSA before we dive in. I am not an archaeologist or a historian, just an amateur who consumes a lot of content. My aim isn't to create an accurate historical video, it is to talk about fantasy world building. And if you want to support me in making more content around fantasy world building, you can join the channel for these cool perks, or just buy a super thanks. Down below is the buttons. Okay, enough of that. Let's crack on. First, we have to talk briefly about the Bronze Age. Now, I've done 3 whole videos on the Bronze Age, so I'm not going to go into detail in this video. You can check them out in the information cards. Suffice to say, the Bronze Age was loads of fun. There was priest kings, mighty empires, immense trade routes, technological advancement. I mean, what's not to love? But all good things come to an end, and so it was with the Bronze Age collapse. The collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations was a complex process, with multiple things going wrong and one thing leading into another. The arrival of mysterious groups like the Sea Peoples who raided and plundered the coastal cities in the Eastern Mediterranean contributed enormously to the downfall of the Bronze Age. Letters were sent back and forth to the various leaders of the Bronze Age complaining about the Sea Peoples. And to this day, we don't know exactly who these Sea Peoples were. It remains a subject of debate. But their impact was felt throughout the region. Then there was a series of earthquakes, there were some droughts, and there was other climactic changes that put enormous pressure on Bronze Age societies. These climactic pressures led to crop failures and famine, and this led to social unrest, which weakened the empires and made them more vulnerable to external threats like the Sea Peoples. Then the interconnected trade networks of the Bronze Age were disrupted by these calamities, and that led to a decline in wealth and resources available. And as the economies of the major powers crumbled, so did their ability to maintain their vast territories and their military forces. And as a result of all this, the great empires of the Bronze Age began to disintegrate. People were not thrilled that their supposedly almighty priest kings had zero answers to these disasters. Cities were abandoned as populations declined, and in some cases people fled to seek refuge elsewhere. During the Bronze Age collapse in the Near East, China experienced its own transitions. The Shang dynasty, a Bronze Age civilization, was overthrown by the Zhou dynasty around 1046 BCE. The Zhou dynasty initially maintained control over a vast territory, but as time went on, the power of the central authority waned and the Chinese realm fractured into multiple smaller states. This period of disunity, known as the Spring and Autumn period from 770 to 476 BCE, set the stage for the rise of Confucius and other influential Chinese philosophers who sought to address the social and political challenges of their time. Basically, there was turmoil everywhere as the Bronze Age civilizations collapsed and once mighty empires disintegrated. And in their death throes, new political systems emerged, and the rise of philosophy and science began to displace the religious authority that had gone before. This period of change and upheaval laid the groundwork for the dawning of the classical era. So as the dust settled, this new era of philosophy and science was born. So let's first talk about the decline of religion and the rise of philosophy. The classical era saw significant changes in religious practices and beliefs. In part, this was due to the disasters that had led to the end of the Bronze Age and the priest kings having no answer for it. And in another part, this was caused by humans learning more about the world around them and moving away from believing that spirits controlled everything. As people strove to understand the world around them, they drifted further and further away from the belief in many spirits controlling everything, especially. After all, if you can understand the dynamics of a waterfall, the idea that a spirit lives inside each waterfall becomes a doubtful proposition. This decrease in polytheistic beliefs had a few major effects, one of which was the introduction of mystery cults as people sought to clung to that sense of the mysterious and the spiritual. Let's take a moment to delve a little deeper into the mystery cults because they are fascinating. These were secret religious groups that offered initiation ceremonies and promised spiritual transformation. Unlike mainstream religions, mystery cults were exclusive clubs, and members were bound by a vow of secrecy. One prime example of a mystery club is the Eleusinian Mysteries, which was centered around the Greek goddess Demeter and Persephone. The initiates would participate in secret rituals and ceremonies, and though we don't know all the details because, well, secret, right? It's said that the participants gained profound spiritual insight and a promise of a better afterlife. I wish my channel membership perks were that good, but sadly all I can offer is the following insights. If you hit the join button, you will get these cool perks. Okay, back to religion. Enough of those plugs. Let's talk about China, where the classical era witnessed the development of various schools of thought, including Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism. Confucianism emphasized morality, family relationships, and social harmony, while Taoism promoted living in harmony with the natural world and following the Tao or the way. Legalism, on the other hand, focused on strict laws and a strong central government. These philosophical systems led to a decline in the power of the priest as the emphasis shifted away from religious rituals and divine authority to ethical conduct and social order. Nonetheless, the Chinese folk religion, with its blend of ancestor worship, local deities, and spirits, continued to be an essential aspect of daily life. When you are building your classical era, do think about this decline of power of the priests as philosophy and science starts to become studied area. How do the priests react to this changing politics in your world? This is especially important if your gods are real. How do they react to philosophies rising and displacing their priests? And if you enjoyed this discussion about religion in the classical era, hit the thumbs up button, and let's talk about philosophies and governance models. And let's start with a strange new government model that grew up around this time: democracy. Now, I already did a video on this topic, which you can check out in the information card, but if we look at Athenian democracy, specifically through the lens of the rise of philosophy as a discipline, it gets very interesting. Some of the key philosophies and concepts that underpin the development of the Athenian democracy include the following: egalitarianism, including equality under the law, a pretty radical concept at the time; civic participation, either through voting or through serving in public office; rule of law rather than rule of rulers; and trial by jury to ensure fairness. If those principles sound familiar, it's because they are to anyone who lives in a Western democracy. Athens, well before the birth of Christ, laid the foundations for the principles that would be much more widely adopted during the Renaissance period in our world and would form the basis for our democracies in this day and age. But why did Athens adopt these principles? What philosophers guided the city into becoming this trailblazer of these principles? Well, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were not directly involved in the establishment of Athenian democracy, but their ideas and philosophies did have a huge impact on the development of political thought in Athens and the wider Greek world. Their teachings contributed to the intellectual milieu that shaped the evolution of Athenian democracy. Socrates, 470 to 399 BCE, is often considered the father of Western philosophy, and his method of questioning and dialogue and teaching through questioning is known as the Socratic method. It greatly influenced political thought in Athens. Even though Socrates himself did not write any of his works, his ideas were documented by his students, most notably by Plato. Now, Socrates was critical of Athenian democracy, especially the potential for the uneducated majority to make poor decisions. But his emphasis on questioning authority, on seeking the truth, and on encouraging active participation in political life contributed to the democratic ethos that gave rise to the Athenian democracy. This tradition was carried on by his student Plato, 427 to 347 BCE. Plato was also critical of the Athenian democracy. In his work, The Republic, he presents the idea of an ideal state ruled not by democracy but by philosopher kings who possess the knowledge and wisdom necessary to govern justly. He believed that democracy could easily descend into chaos and tyranny, as the masses could be swayed by demagogues. Despite his criticisms, Plato's ideas on the importance of justice, the rule of law, and the necessity of education for those in power have had a lasting influence on democratic theory. And in his shoes stepped his student Aristotle. Always two there are, master and apprentice, ready to guide Athens. I'm not sure that Sith analogy works, but anyway. Getting back to the philosophers, back to Aristotle, the student of Plato, who was more accepting of democracy than either Socrates or Plato. But Aristotle still believed in a mixed government with elements of democracy, but also aristocracy and monarchy. He thought this was the best way forward. In his work, Politics, Aristotle outlined the strengths and weaknesses of various political systems and argued that a polity or constitutional government with a balance of power among the different social classes would lead to a more stable and just society. His ideas on the importance of a strong middle class, the rule of law, and the need for checks and balances in government have influenced our governments to this day. So basically, the philosophers of Athens contributed to the thought process of Athens, which gave rise to a type of government in that framework that they built around how to think. Now, is this kind of philosophy contributing to government, contributing to society, contributing to government borne out elsewhere in the classical world? Let's take a look at China. Confucius, 551 to 479 BCE, was a Chinese philosopher and teacher whose ideas significantly influenced Chinese culture, governance, and society during the classical period. His teachings, known as Confucianism, emphasized moral virtues, social harmony, and proper conduct in personal and political life. Some key Confucian principles that shaped Chinese governance models during the classical period are filial piety, or the respect and devotion that children should show their parents and elders; This concept extended to the relationship between the ruler and the ruled, with the ruler being seen as a father figure and the people as his children. Confucius believed that a well-ordered society could be achieved through the proper cultivation of relationships. He identified 5 key relationships: ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife, elder brother and younger brother, friend and friend. Each relationship had specific roles and responsibility, and by fulfilling these roles, harmony and order could be maintained. Confucius emphasized the importance of rituals and ceremonies as a means of cultivating moral virtues and maintaining social order. Rituals serve to reinforce hierarchical structure of society and regulate behavior, contributing to the stability and harmony of the state and to the longevity of the Chinese empires. Confucius further believed that in order for society to function properly, people must fully understand and fulfill their roles. This concept required that the titles and names accurately reflect the duties and responsibilities associated with a given position, ensuring that individuals adhere to their roles within the social hierarchy. In a way, you can tie this back to Plato and his love for onomancy, though Plato went mystical with it, believing that a person's destiny was controlled by their name, which I'll speak more about a little bit later. And Confucius had a more practical application, which can be simply expressed as words matter. Confucius argued that rulers should govern with benevolence and lead by example, demonstrating moral virtue and righteousness. A ruler who embodied these qualities would inspire loyalty and obedience from their subjects, leading to a harmonious and well-governed state. And finally, and this is the big one that made a huge difference to Chinese societies, Confucius advocated for the selection of government officials based on merit and ability rather than hereditary status and wealth. This idea laid the groundwork for the imperial examination system, which was implemented during the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE to 220 CE, and became a cornerstone of Chinese governance for centuries. In fact, until the revolution that led to Mao taking over. And you can see that some of these philosophies still influence the Chinese state even past the communist revolution. Certainly, the meritocracy selection kept the Chinese imperial system alive long after its monarchy equivalents had died in the West. Now, I am not trying to advocate for one system or the other here. I'm just talking about world-building elements. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is that philosophy and governance models line up. The Greeks were all about questioning and adopted probably the most debating style of governance. The Chinese were about doing your job in accordance to your title, on the merit of your skills as a person within the social hierarchy. And their form of government supported this model. Now, you could ask which came first, society, government, or philosophers, to which I say, yes. Jokes aside, it is a little bit of all three, because humans are messy, and the three fed each other and gave rise to these governance supported by philosophy. Does this model really hold true for other governments in the classical era? Well, yes. Roman philosophy was heavily influenced by Greek thought, with Stoicism and Epicureanism being two of the most popular schools of thought. Stoicism emphasized rationality, self-control, and the pursuit of virtue, while Epicureanism focused on the pursuit of pleasure, friendship, and tranquility within reason. Roman philosophers such as Seneca and Cicero contributed to the development of ethical and political thought, with their ideas shaping Roman society and governance. Rome was all about contributing to Rome and working for your citizenship, and their philosophers contributed to that. I would argue that both Stoicism and Epicureanism make their followers more resilient. And if there is one thing you have to give Rome, it is this: they were resilient. They started out as a kingdom, violently overthrew their kings, moved to a democracy, carving out a huge empire as a democracy. Then they switched over to actual empire and still survived to influence our societies today. Crisis after crisis, they kept going for more years than they had any right to do. And I believe that their philosophers contributed to their people having a mindset of resilience. But what about across the Mediterranean in Africa? Well, Carthage was a mercantile democracy with a system of government that combined elements of democracy with an oligarchy. Wealthy merchants and the ruling elite held considerable power, while the General Assembly of Citizens also had influence over decision-making and laws. And Carthage's surviving work of science and philosophy is Margo's agricultural treatise, which, although the actual text is lost, was clearly highly regarded in antiquity, since Pliny the Elder, a Roman naturalist and author, refers to Margo's work as an authoritative source on agriculture. This suggests that Margo was a learned figure in Carthaginian society, contributing to its intellectual and practical knowledge. So you can see here that they had this mercantile empire supported by a practical science-based philosophy. One of the strangest examples of this kind of philosophy supports governance models is probably Egypt, which was governed by a pharaohic dynasty where the ruler was still considered divine and held absolute authority. But the fusion of Egyptian and Greek cultures during the Ptolemaic dynasty led to the blending of religious practices and the rise of centers of learning like the Library of Alexandria. So you had these centers of learning based on the Greek model of question everything. And these centers of learning were supported by the divine pharaoh that was still considered to be a god and a king. It's just an amazing blend of cultural development, in my opinion. So to cut a long story short, and this section has been lengthy, in your classical era, you can have democracy, but you can also go with an empire, a kingdom, or even a god king in your world building. The important element of classical era governments is to remember and to think about how your philosophy and your philosophers underpin your system of government and the society of your world. Confucius-type philosophies more easily lead to empires. Greek-style philosophies more easily lead to democracies. A heavy mercantile society like Carthage is more likely to spit out naturalist philosophers who focus on real-world stuff like Margo. Now, this is not to say that you can't mix and match, because there was Egypt. But just bear in mind that it is more likely to have philosophies that match colors with governments than not. And if you enjoyed this discussion of philosophies and governments, hit the thumbs up button, and let's talk about daily life during the classical period. Now, this varied wildly across civilizations. Of course it did. And also in terms of social classes, because this was still a very stratified society. In terms of their homes, Romans lived in very different houses depending on their status. Poor people lived in simple apartments or insula. The rich lived in elaborate villas or domus. These wealthy homes were often decorated with frescoes or wall paintings. And remember, you want art in your world. Art lets you show your readers the history of your world in an organic way. Maybe a fresco can show a great philosopher giving a speech or a god saving a maiden, and this can convey that same information to your reader without being an infodump. Anyway, back to homes. In Egypt, they lived mostly in mud brick houses with flat roofs, offering separate spaces for work and living. Sometimes gardens were grown on those flat roofs as well. And in the Far East, over in China, they lived in houses with a large central courtyard. So the house was built around this open courtyard, and then they had separate rooms for family members and also a room set aside for ancestral worship. Clothing-wise, again, it varied from region to region depending on the materials they had available. Greeks and Romans both wore simple draped garments like the chiton and the himation for Greeks. I think I butchered those names, but anyway. The toga for Romans, both of them made from linen or wool. Egyptians wore light linen garments due to the hot climates with various styles depending on their social status. And in China, they had silk for the richer people and hemp for the peasants, with distinctive styles for different social classes, often featuring intricate embroidery and patterns. Speaking of classes and styles, remember that sumptuary laws would likely have applied during this time, same as they did during the Renaissance and Middle Ages and so on. Sumptuary laws are laws that govern which social classes can wear what items of clothing, and you can check out my thoughts on sumptuary laws in the information card. Okay. Let's move on to occupations in the classical world. Of course, you would have all of your normal jobs like farmers and craftsmen and traders and merchants, and all of these were prevalent in societies. Merchants especially would be important. There has been Roman glass found in China and Chinese silk found in Rome, indicating that there was some trade across the length of the whole Eurasian continent. And certainly the overland trade route between Europe and Asia was traveled during this time. I did a video on that one too. Link either in the information card or down below, depending on whether I've run out of information cards yet. Anyway, some countries would have specific types of professions. Like in Greece and Rome, soldiers, philosophers, and teachers would be common professions. In Egypt, scribes would make bank. So here, with the Library of Alexandria and the focus on preserving knowledge, you would have many more scribes than you would have in other parts of the classical world. In China, if you could pass the government exams set up by Confucius's philosophies, being a government bureaucrat was a lucrative profession. So again, you can see the philosophies shaping the societies which shape the specific kind of jobs you would have available. Eating-wise, you had most modern food at this time, though sugar, salt, and spices would remain luxury items until much later. Interestingly, you could have fast food during this time. The Romans were known for their thermopylae, which were ancient fast food type establishments serving hot, ready-to-eat meals for busy city dwellers. So essentially your McDonald's or your Burger King or whatever that you stop by on your way home from work. Then in terms of societal equality, unless you change this by means of tweaking your history, your physiology, or your magic or something like that, you're probably not looking at an equal society. Women's status varied across different cultures, but was generally much more limited compared to men. The Athenian Greeks especially seemed to really dislike women, but in Sparta, women had many more rights than they did in Athens. Women often played essential roles in the household, religion, and the economy. Slavery was a common feature in many classical societies. Slaves were often used as a labor force and in some cases even for entertainment. Of course, during the Bronze Age, you had slavery as well, but in the classical age, slavery was super widespread. People were bought and sold at huge marketplaces, And during the Roman Empire period, the whole economy pretty much ran on slavery. People on the losing side of a war were almost always enslaved. So it was definitely not a time of sunshine and roses if you lost a war. And if you enjoyed that discussion of daily life, hit the thumbs up button and let's talk about that all-important fantasy element, mysticism and magic. While the classical era saw a rise in rationalism and critical inquiry, many philosophers still had a mystical aspect to their thinking. For example, Plato believed in onomancy, the idea that the meaning of a person's name could reveal their destiny. Stoic philosophers embraced the concept of a universal force, the logos, which connected all things, much like the Force in Star Wars. In the context of a fantasy world, this blend of mysticism and philosophy can inspire the creation of unique magic systems that integrate seamlessly into a classic era equivalent timeline. So, for example, you could consider the following ideas for designing such a magic system. You could have magic as a natural extension of philosophical thought. In this approach, magic could be seen as an advanced application of philosophical and scientific concepts, with practitioners using their understanding of natural laws, ethics, and the universe to manipulate reality. So basically, you could study magic like it was a science and learn to manipulate the forces of the universe by using this scientific magic. But if you don't like the idea of a PhD in magic, you could also root your magic in mysticism and spiritual practices. Drawing from the mystical elements of the classical era philosophies, magic could be tied to rituals, meditation, or other spiritual practices that allow the practitioner to tap into the divine or cosmic forces. Here, you're basically striving for enlightenment within the cosmos, and if you achieve it, or partially achieve it, this allows you to manipulate the forces of magic. Of course, neither of these could appeal to you, and you could instead turn to, say, Taoism and other nature-focused philosophies. And here, magic could be linked to the elements, the cycles, and the seasons, or even the movements of celestial bodies, with practitioners harnessing those natural forces for various purposes. If I was designing a magic system like this, I would lean into elemental magic systems, and I did do a variety of videos on a variety of magic systems, including elemental magic and onomancy, which you can check out on my channel. I am also bringing out shortly a video on binary suns, where I will also talk about using celestial bodies as a totemistic magic system. So subscribe if you want to be notified about that one. But if none of those appeal, maybe here is a last completely off-the-wall suggestion for a magic system. How about magic as a reflection of the social order? So in a world where the ideas of philosophers like Confucius or Plato hold sway, magic could be structured around social hierarchies, with practitioners having access to different types or levels of magic based on their roles or status within society. I think this would work well in a progression-type world like Will White's Cradle, where the higher your magic, the higher your status. But now you take it one step further and say that you draw power from your status in society, and thus increasing your status also increases your magic. I think that you could make a truly fascinating and unique magic system using such an element. And in the system, people would be eternally scheming for that one extra step up the ladder, which always makes for great conflict and story. Whatever your system, do remember to explore the implications of your chosen magic system on both society, politics, and daily life of your fantasy system, so that it looks believable and is internally consistent within your world. And if you enjoyed that discussion of magic systems, hit the thumbs up button and let's talk about key questions you should ask if designing a classical era fantasy. What philosophies have arisen? What are their core tenets? What mystical elements have arisen? How did the philosophies and the mystical elements influence the government, and what government model grew from it? And what influence did the philosophies have on religion, and how much has the power of the priests declined since the Bronze Age? And those are my thoughts on the classical period in a fantasy world. If you want to support this channel, links to my books down below, or you can hit the join button right there for these cool perks, or the super thanks button if you enjoyed this video. And if you did enjoy this video, please do check out my video on using philosophy as a religion in a fantasy world. And I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time Worlds.